So I think if we could start with some introductions, a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what Pride Month means to you. James, if we could come to you first.
I'm James Nikopoulos. I'm the Clinical Director and person responsible at the Lister Fertility Clinic. And that weird second part of the name means that I've got to make sure that the clinic does everything it should do in terms of HFEA regulations, which is an interesting part of my job. Pride Month is incredibly important in making sure everybody's aware of access options to them as a community. And it shouldn't be just about the month itself. It's something we should be focusing on, all year round.
Absolutely. And Kay, if you introduce you now as well.
So I'm Kay Nicholson. I'm the CEO of Liberate Jersey, which is the diversity and equality charity on the island. And Pride Month obviously is a very important time in our calendar. I personally feel that Pride Month is very important, as James said, for visibility, for representation, and also for that community building as well, so that we see ourselves represented within the wider community. And as somebody who grew up on the island with very little representation of LGBTQ identities. As an adult, it's something that's even more important to me now, especially in light of seeing the kind of global rollbacks of rights around the world.
Yeah, 100%. And we really appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule for joining us today.
You're welcome.
And Nick?
Thanks, Chloe. Yeah, so my name's Advocate Nick Lacane. I'm partner of the family and private client law firm Corbett Lacane, and I'm also a governor of Tiny Seed. So in terms of what Pride means to me, historically it's meant the promotion of rights, dignity and equality, and I think that's even more so this year with the introduction of the Children and Civil Status Amendments Law, which will really take sort of great strides in improving things for everyone. So it's good that we've been finally listened to and things are moving forward. So a very positive step.
Thank you. Yeah, we've got a brilliant panel with us today and we really appreciate you all being with us, so thank you. So we want to give as much information as we can during this short session that we have. And I think if we could start by setting the scene a bit, talking about what is possible, what's not, the challenges that the LGBTQ plus community are facing when they are starting to build a family. So when we talk about that, when we talk about the LGBTQ plus community starting families, what are the main routes to parenthood that are currently available here in Jersey and beyond if you need support off island as well?
As you know, the initial steps are often artificial insemination, or IUI, I believe, on island. Obviously, it's the least invasive option, frustratingly, the least successful option. Hopefully it will be a successful option, but if not, the next step in terms of potential IVF becomes an off-island option with monitoring in Jersey. Clearly IVF is more invasive, it's more costly, there is funding issues which we'll come back to shortly. There are options as to where people in Jersey can go to for that treatment off-island. And the success rate of these treatments are very much dependent on the age of the person providing the eggs. There's also the option of reciprocal IVF for same-sex female couples, and we'll often see a couple look at their relative ages, look at their markers of egg reserve, and help them decide which route to take first in terms of who should perhaps go for an egg collection first, who should perhaps consider a transfer first, to basically maximize their chance of achieving the family they want in a way that they want. And the most important thing is listening and having a conversation about what's right for an individual or a couple, and then taking things forward.
Same-sex female couples. So what sort of options would there be for a male couple looking to explore?
Yeah, we see lots of single men who are thinking about starting a family and want to maximize their chances, and also same-sex male couples. And then again, the options really there. It's a two-step process. The first step is creating those embryos, and the second step is finding an appropriate surrogate. And most clinics will have an egg bank that they work with. And again, it's going through all the required screening for the couple to be able to create the embryos, helping them source a donor egg, an egg donor that they're happy with. And that's often historically been the trickiest thing and the most time-consuming option. Now that, thankfully, is significantly shorter with some of the egg banks that we work with. And creating the embryo, frustratingly, is often the easy bit. Where things become a little bit more of a minefield is the surrogacy process in terms of finding an appropriate surrogate, which is very hard within the UK. And some of the options overseas are incredibly expensive. And if you're not going to go to the US, for example, which is incredibly expensive because it's more commercialized, then regulation becomes a problem, because some of the other places where people are going to for surrogacy, because they're struggling with either cost or access elsewhere, make me a little bit uncomfortable, because the regulation, there is no regulation. So parenthood becomes an issue. Some of the legal aspects become an issue. So it's a little bit of a minefield, but there are organizations we work with that help people and couples through that process. But step one is creating the embryos. Step two is then accessing the surrogacy resource.
Yeah, thank you. So I think you've kind of covered our second question, and you've touched on those hurdles and the barriers that people are facing. So I think if I now talk to Nick and ask from a legal perspective, what rights do LGBTQ plus parents have, and where are those gaps, especially when it comes to surrogacy, donor conception, co-parenting, and all the different paths that we're talking about?
So at the moment, sadly, the rights really aren't there, or there aren't a great deal. So giving birth to a child will always have parental responsibility for that child. The father named on the birth certificate will also have parental responsibility. But the issue that you then have is that you're having to apply for residence orders, for example, for same-sex female couples, for the person not carrying the child. So that has been distressing, taking up a great deal of time, expensive for all those involved. Now, I mentioned during the introduction that the Children and Civil Status Amendments Jersey Law 2024 is due to come in the autumn. So that will really move us forward in the process. Now, that allows for the registration of a second parent in same-sex couples, so they'll be named on a child's birth certificate. Now, that's provided they're the spouse, the civil partner, or the partner of the mother and involved in the fertility treatment. So that will really, as I say, move things forward. And with same-sex female couples, they can also re-register their child's birth to include a second parent's name, which removes that stigma and, again, any sort of issues aligned to that. So I'm fully supportive of the new law and what it's trying to do and what it hopefully will do.
Kay, what do you hear most from the community? How do people feel about the current options and the regulations that are in place? Are people hopeful, frustrated about what's possible, or just what's the general view?
So in terms of the kind of the medical routing, there has been issues raised in terms of the lack of clarity when people are starting out on the journey. So, getting differing opinions or advice from GPs. I think there needs to be a clearer pathway that is very clearly communicated to people who are looking to go through ARU for fertility treatments. So that can be a bit of a frustration. Obviously, financial barriers are a really clear frustration for a lot of people, particularly those who might need IVF but then are, as you've mentioned earlier, forced to go through IUI that is self-funded. So there's the, I don't know if you've heard of the gay tax, and that being a kind of hurdle that is not faced by heterosexual couples because the IUI is not charged. In terms of the legislation, we've been waiting. I mean, my son was born 9 years ago. And I was told when I went to the registry office then that the law would be changing soon. And I've campaigned since his birth for that law to come in. Amazing progress was made under the last government in terms of pushing that forward. So we're at the kind of last part now to really get that law enacted. And that's been a huge level of frustration and concern for all parents, because not having that legal protection, and also as a community, I think not having that representation and that equality, our children not having equality with their peers in terms of both of their parents being on a birth certificate. It's something that really needs to be addressed as soon as possible.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that that will be enacted without any further delays. So broadly speaking, lots of positive experiences of ARU. People have found that ARU has been a very supportive place once they've accessed it and found what the routes are. There is some degree, I think, that comes naturally with being in a minority and marginalised group where and this isn't specific to ARU, this is, say, even with GPs or other care providers, that where there might be a sense of is this fair or am I being treated equitably, there's a fear around perhaps raising a concern because the worry is that in some way that's going to impact access. So I think some things could perhaps be done on making sure that there's transparency and awareness raising within the care providers to provide that level of security and equity between all of the people who are accessing their services.
I fully agree with everything that you're saying. I think it's, you talk about those inequalities with the birth certificates. It always astounds me that, in a heterosexual couple, there's no regulation on that. Any man could be named as the parent on the birth certificate. He may not be the biological father. There's no checks, no questions. Yet, for same-sex female couples, that is not the case. I think it's also worth pointing out, because like you say, communication is key. Actually, for anybody listening, you can self-refer straight to the assisted reproduction unit. You don't have to go to your GP first. But again, that's something that's not necessarily communicated widely and people aren't aware of.
Yeah.
And talking about those financial barriers, that eliminates those GP costs. Obviously, they're only a small element of it, but it does eliminate those GP costs if you want to go straight to the assisted reproduction unit and start that process from there. You can do that. So thank you. And I think moving on to discussing I think we've touched on it a lot already about what's working, what's not, and who is left out. I guess the question to everybody, do you think enough is being done to make the path to parenthood inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community? And if not, what is missing? Like I said, I think a lot of that's already been touched on, but if anybody has anything to add at this point, please do.
No, I completely agree, and I say the new law is something that we've waited a very long time for, but it's going to really help us, isn't it? Really going to assist us.
Yeah, I do think it's worth noting though that this only protects people who go through the kind of ARU route. So if there are couples who want to, say, have a donor who's a friend, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that the law actually then grants that to couples who use, say, a family friend or what have you as a private donor, as opposed to going through an official route via ARU, via sperm bank in that sense. Am I right?
That's right, yeah.
So I still think, even when this law comes in, I still think there are gaps that are going to be there that we're going to need to kind of carry forward. Obviously, this is a huge improvement, massive leap forward from where we are now. But it's not going to stop there. There are still going to be some things that we need to kind of consider in terms of the way that families are created and in terms of the diversity of families as well. I think there needs to be a better understanding and representation of the diversity of families. That includes single parents. We have single LGBTQ people who want to be parents. And also not ignoring the other elements of LGBTQ identities. I think it's very clear that we consider gay male couples and we consider lesbian couples, but bisexual folk as well, queer people, trans people, they're even less visible in this as well. So it's really important that we keep those conversations happening and bring those people forwards into the conversation as well. And where they might be missing from the legislation once it is brought in, what do we then need to do to kind of bring that forward and bridge as many gaps as we can to really bring that equality in for as many people as possible?
It sounds like there's some really positive changes happening in terms of legally in Jersey, but also in the UK in general. There was going to be a big drive to review the whole parental order issue and the birth mother being the mother, but those are ground to a halt, frustratingly. At some point they may be revisited, but that could make a significant difference to things over here. And also I was doing another podcast, sort of talking about some of the legal aspects of parenthood and the community. And I do think it's really important in terms of what they were saying about other options, the home insemination options, the pre-clinic options. My medical stroke legal hat on would say that clearly people who are having treatment within clinics do have the protection of the HFEA and the regulation if they're doing it in the UK. That's very much not the case with home insemination. And on that podcast I was doing with a lawyer over here, we know we do see some very, very unpleasant, complicated legal cases that come out of some of these cases. They're a real minority, but it's just worth making sure people are aware of the differences in legal protection depending on how they do conceive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually then removing the financial barriers and making the official routes more accessible to everybody then means that there isn't that barrier in place and there's greater legal protections. Absolutely.
Fully hear your point on that, definitely, and support that. Because again, like we were saying before about how you have to fund 6 cycles of IUI prior to qualifying for that IVF. Actually, they do say you have to demonstrate that you've been trying for 12 months. So almost that's encouraging those routes that you're talking about before qualifying for that funding, which, like you say, when you're talking about the safer routes, the more legislated routes that are available, having those barriers beforehand essentially is pushing some people down.
Can I ask you a question? How much is a cycle of IUI on Ireland that if you're going to self-fund it?
I think all in, with potentially if you're purchasing donor sperm as well, I think you're looking with the medication around 2,000 a cycle. I would say.
So there is the frustrating thing about that is if you're spending £12,000 on 6 cycles of IUI, that's going to buy you 1.5 cycles of IVF.
Exactly.
And the question then becomes not only are people being perhaps pushed into home insemination routes more, actually they're being pushed perhaps to fund IVF that they should be getting state funding for. But if you were sitting there saying, I'm desperate to start a family, why would you spend £12,000 on 6 cycles and the emotional roller coaster with a success rate that's probably less than an IVF cycle? It just seems like it's a topsy-turvy way of doing it, isn't it? They're much better served financially, much better served by offering that one IVF cycle straight away.
Exactly. Yeah, with much higher success rates as well. So, James, what role do you think inclusive language and education play in fertility services, and how do you make clinics and care feel safer for the LGBTQ+ community?
I think it's really, really important. I think that it's important that clinics are aware of the things that they write and they say. Force of habit and history is not an excuse for saying and writing the wrong thing and not being aware of the importance of all of these things. I think whoever walks into this clinic, they have to feel safe and comfortable and feel that they will go through this journey and feel that dignity that Nick was saying earlier. I think it's really important that you work with partners. You know, we work really closely with LGBTQ Mummies Tribe over here, and to dads and various other groups, and we got them in here years ago just to make sure that the stuff that we say and write is appropriate and that we weren't missing anything through just because we were. So it was really important to make sure that we were saying and doing everything in the right way. And having partners that you work with, having partners that you do these sorts of things with, to make sure that the community know that we do things in the right way, that we are inclusive, we encourage the diversity of treatment, is important.
Yeah.
And it is a factor that unfortunately makes couples stay away and individuals stay away. And it stops them accessing those treatments they should in clinics that perhaps should be giving them a good service.
Now, I remember when sort of first starting the charity, it was actually a single person saying to me, when I went to fill out the consent forms, there was no tick box for single person. It was what's your partner's name or what's your marital status, but there was no option to tick single. So from the very outset, she felt like she was in the minority and perhaps not being seen by that clinic.
And that seems archaic now, doesn't it? And there's so many other things since then that probably have need changing, let alone that. But it's incredibly archaic hearing that now, isn't it?
It is. It really is.
Removes that social stigma, which was the whole point of, or one of the many points of Pride in the first place, because it's so unnecessary and so easy to change. You know, amending a form. So, yeah.
Yeah. So coming to you, Nick, now, what protections or considerations should be in place for same-sex parents when it comes to legal parenthood or residence?
So, as we touched on before, a lot of the pitfalls will fall away. Certainly, a lot of the birth certificate issues that we encounter as lawyers will fall away. PR will be given to both parents where the child is born to a surrogate mother, so that's another leap forward. And the new law also aims to remove discrimination and ensure that all children are, regardless of their parents and their parents' circumstances, have equal rights and recognition. So again, I suppose it's another thing that's removing that social stigma. It becomes the norm. It's perfectly sensible. It's perfectly accessible, and we move forward on an equal footing.
Coming to UK, like obviously we're demonstrating here, representation really matters. What impact does visibility of the LGBTQ plus families have, especially for younger people considering their future and their family building options?
It's hugely important. I mean, as I said, I grew up here, and I remember thinking at 16 that if I came out, I would have to give up being a mum, because I had no representation. It wasn't something that I thought was available to me. That's partly due to my age. That's, this was in the 2000s. It's partly due to, I think, being on an island community, that there wasn't the level of representation that perhaps I might have seen had I been in the UK. So that's why Pride is important, is that we see a lot of families coming along. I think younger generations now know, they have the representation, they have it in media, they have it in the books that they're reading, they have it on social media, they have it when they come to Pride and they see families like mine and other families and all of us coming together and celebrating. So visible representation is crucial. It's really important, because if we can't see ourselves represented, if younger people can't see adults living full and happy lives and taking on those roles if they want to be parents, then they can't envision it for themselves. And being able to do that is something really powerful. And it's that sense of belonging, challenging those perceived barriers, even in things like adverts. And Lister is very good at, I think, in their adverts, having diverse representation to make, not just represent a heteronormative 2.4 family, but also ensuring that there's diverse representation within even those things like clinic material and, going to a lawyer and knowing that lawyer is going to represent all family structures. And so it's that kind of visible representation day to day, which is really important. And as somebody said earlier, Pride is not just about the month of June or whenever Pride might be held. It should be about the ways in which minority and marginalised voices are represented and included every single day, not just this kind of one-off tick box exercise. So and children as well. My child sees other families, other LGBTQ families as well, and that's massively important for his sense of belonging in the world, to know that he's not the only person in the world with two mums, and that his friends have diverse family structures as well. And lots of that can be done as well through, school discussions, through books as well. There's great books now that represent not just mum and dad families, but single parent families and adoption, fostering and carer status and LGBTQ families. So having that representation and actually allyship of other people as well, talking to your kids, even if you're not LGBTQ, talking about there being other families and other children who have two mums or two dads or one mum or one dad or what have you. And just as Nick was saying, normalising diverse family structures.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's changed from when you, like you say, over time, from when you were that little girl? It does feel like things are changing, doesn't it?
It has, absolutely. Yeah, it has. And that's an amazing thing to happen in my lifetime. And I'm obviously so grateful that I have been able to have a child and I didn't have to make that choice. And I hope that now generations, a 16-year-old now isn't going to think that is a choice they have to make. They're going to know that parenthood is still available to them regardless of their sexuality.
Definitely. I hope so.
It's interesting. The amount of anxiety that must have caused in somebody who was thinking about their future life and their family building 20 years ago, when these options weren't accessible or weren't being spoken about, that change is actually just thinking about what you were saying. It is a phenomenal change in 20 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I've got to say, from from a fertility clinician's point of view, people often ask me what's changed, what will we move forward? And frustratingly, scientifically, almost nothing has changed. I hate to say in 15 or 20 years. And actually, that is one of the biggest changes in the fertility sector as well. Massively important. Sorry, I'm almost thinking out loud, but yeah, just
no, it's good. It's like having these conversations is great, and like you say, just putting it out there and discussing it. So one thing I wanted to discuss is donor regulation. So if you have IVF with donor sperm in the UK, it's regulated under the HFEA, which is the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. And those donors, there is a cap on the number of times a donor can be used in the UK, and it goes onto a central registry. So when a child reaches a certain age, if they want to find out information about their donor, they can do. And all donors in the UK have to be non-anonymous, which means that a child can access that information at a later date. In Jersey, particularly when people are using IUI, which is performed solely on the island, which is artificial insemination often using donor sperm. Currently in Jersey, we have no regulations on that. There's no donor registry. There's no cap on the number of times a donor can be used. And there is also, it can either be anonymous or non-anonymous, which has kind of implications for a child at a later date if an anonymous donor is used, and also on the number of times that donor can be used in the islands. I just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on that, really. Kay from the sort of family building side of things and Nick on the regulation side, just what your opinions are on that.
I think it would be needed here. I think there should be some regulation around that, particularly if, as we're seeing with kind of the financial barriers, that if we're using local, and I don't know what the provision is, I assume it would be a kind of private arrangement rather than, say, in the way that in Europe and the UK there are sperm banks and things. I think it would be definitely something that would be a good thing to have here in terms of regulation and protection, absolutely. And those kind of limitations are worth always bearing in mind, because you can have IUI here with a donor that might be okay outside of the UK, but then if you need that donor to then have IVF in the UK and that donor has reached their limit in the UK, you can't then transfer that over for IVF treatment into the UK. So that's worth bearing in mind, particularly if you've spent a lot of money on sperm and then you can't move it. And invested
a lot of emotion into choosing that donor as well.
All the time.
The time spent choosing that donor to then find that you can't transfer them. So I think we were talking about how key communication is, and just having all that information from the outset rather than discovering it part way along your journey. But what you were talking about before, you can bring a donor, people do bring donors in from the European Sperm Bank or Cryos or some of the big donor sperm banks. But that regulation, like we were talking about, that's only covered under the clinics regulation as opposed to the HFEA UK regulation. So most clinics have a cap of 75 times that donor can be used. I mean, that's very high. Very, very high. So that's the only cap that you would be covered under Jersey, or lack of Jersey law at the moment. So where are your thoughts?
It's certainly something that you and I have discussed, Chloe, as a concern. And I think, I've had discussions with Kay this morning about sort of striking while the iron's hot. And I think while this is a hot topic and being dealt with, let's not let it get forgotten. And when the new law comes in, we keep campaigning, we keep trying to move things forward so that we've got as near a perfect legislation, regulations in place as we can.
Yeah, it's really worth bearing in mind. I think, again, as we said, the communication point, so that everybody has as much information and access to information, clear information as possible. Because certainly when I kind of went through IVF and IUI, there were a number of times where I was blindsided because there was some kind of restriction that we hadn't been made aware of, or, we couldn't move the donor sperm from here to the UK for IVF, which again, then we had to go through a whole search again for a completely new donor, completely different sperm bank, and which brings with it.
As it is, without being thrown curveballs and not being able to make informed choices because you haven't been given all the information from the outset.
Exactly. So as much information as possible, which is something that you do brilliantly, is obviously you're providing that information from the outset. And I think also as I've said, medical practitioners, care providers, knowing all of this as well, so that they can communicate that very clearly, to avoid that kind of that happening,
It's unexpected,
unexpectedly,
yeah.
because everything, when we're doing these cycles, everything is so unexpected as it is. It's such a stressful, time-consuming, draining process.
Yeah.
And so to minimise as many kind of unexpected elements as possible is best, and will hopefully make that whole journey much easier for anybody going through it.
Yeah, definitely. And for the implications for any future children as well. And I think that's, really important. And again, something that can sometimes get a little bit lost in those clinical conversations is how that's actually going to translate into a child growing up and their future, and what that will look like as well. Strike while the iron's hot and keep the conversation going and open, and have these collaborations like Tiny Seeds talking to Liberate, and understanding that everybody wants the same thing and the best for everybody in these. So, yeah.
I think June, being Pride Month as well, a lot of the time when I'm talking, I do a lot of talks about in this month, and allyship is the key theme for anybody who talks to me about it. Of course, within the LGBTQ community, we can advocate for ourselves and things, but there's so much power in allyship. There's so much power in collaboration, and that's not to be underestimated. And we need it. Marginalised and minority voices always need allies. And it's having, when you're in those rooms talking about those people who might not be considered. So, we didn't form Liberate. We're not formed part of that initial consultation on the IVF funding proposal. And I was so heartened to see Tiny Seeds and Jersey Women's Health Hub had already picked up the barriers for LGBTQ families straight away. And I thought, what an amazing demonstration of allyship right there, that, even without kind of the initial direct consultation with us as an example.
Although you should absolutely have been included in that conversation.
It would have been nice to have been included, certainly, because as I said when I was asked by the media, that, this is going to impact a lot of, all LGBTQ couples. We can't go ahead and do this without some kind of assistance. So it was always going to impact us, and I hope that going forward we will form part of that stakeholder group. But having said that, that allyship was so important, to know that we LGBTQ families were not being ignored because we're not the majority, that it was still brought in, and so I just wanted to thank you for that, because it was really important.
Yeah. No, I mean, definitely. I mean, we are here as a charity to support absolutely anybody facing a struggle or a challenge to build their family. And that includes the LGBTQ community completely. And I think it's also worth highlighting that I think sometimes it can be viewed that, obviously, when you're going through infertility, there is an obvious barrier, an obvious struggle. Sometimes people can think that perhaps it's easier for a same-sex couple to undergo fertility treatment, that they might have a higher chance of success rates than somebody going through infertility and IVF. Absolutely not. That doesn't mean that one part of those couples doesn't have PCOS.
Exactly.
Or doesn't have endometriosis, or hasn't, doesn't have a struggle, or isn't going to face challenges and barriers. And that's why we are there to support absolutely anybody. Absolutely anybody can come along to our fertility support meetings. Anybody can reach out for help. Anybody, please come and chat to us and hear about your options.
I think it's important that employers understand that as well. I faced discrimination in a workplace from somebody who had assumed, and verbally told me this, that having a child wouldn't be an issue for me, in terms of they didn't think I was going to have a child by virtue of my sexuality, and that if I did have a child, quote unquote, people like me shouldn't have children and shouldn't be helped to have children. So there is still, and that was 10 years ago. But I think for employers to understand that fertility matters don't only impact heterosexual people. And of course, the partners are often invisible as well in this. So I think, employers and family and friends might recognise more so when there's a heterosexual couple going through fertility treatment, the ways in which that might impact the partner rather than the birthing parent. So very often there's a degree of invisibility for the partner in a same-sex relationship, I think, because there's that kind of.
That's a lot of work. We're doing a lot of work in the workplace around support for people going through a fertility struggle, and having that support for partners is a huge part of it as well. We ask them that when they develop their fertility policy, partners are given the same allowances as they're giving to the person going through the treatment and the leave as well. There's work to be done, but we're doing it, and we're hopefully making those changes. So I think finally, to wrap up, we've covered a lot, but if you could change one thing tomorrow to make parenthood more accessible to the LGBTQ plus community, what would it be? James, I will come to you first.
I think we've nailed it already. Funding. I think funding is the key. It sounds like it's the biggest rate limiting step now. So equity and funding, really.
In order to give a different answer, because obviously I agree with James's point, I think also education and awareness raising, particularly of staff that, and as I've said, care providers at all stages of that journey. Because once you get through, you might have a really positive experience with ARU, with Lister, which is very inclusive. And then maybe perhaps if you are successful, then you're moving into a different part of your journey. And having a consistency of care and understanding inclusivity is really important, so that journey is something really positive and really welcoming. So I think that would, outside of the funding point, that would be my biggest thing to see, is the better awareness and education of staff.
I think James touched on the issues with surrogacy, and America, incredibly expensive, incredibly difficult, other countries, less regulation, which makes it more difficult. So as a bit of advice in terms of what we see with our clients, is consider family and friends first. Look at your own doorstep first. It makes things a lot easier, a lot cheaper, hopefully a lot simpler. Surrogacy is a potential issue, but there are solutions out there if people look.
Thank you. I think that kind of sums it up, doesn't it? There are barriers, there are still hurdles, but there are options and there are solutions, and you can come and talk to us, you can come and talk to Liberate, you can have a conversation with James at the Lister, you can talk to Nick for legal advice. Does anyone have anything finally that they would like to say? Any one last piece of advice or anything that you would like to give?
The only other thing I always whenever people ask me about surrogacy, is go and see someone like Nick as soon as possible when you're thinking about surrogacy, just to make sure you really understand everything that journey in front of you means. And I think the sooner people seek that advice, the better, because the bit we do is the easy bit. It's everything that happens afterwards that can be problematic. So seeking that legal input is really important.
Fabulous, yeah. And actually, Nick, we have discussed in the past that people can access Corbett Lecane's support. I think you offer like a free 1 hour
very
session.
Happy to provide a free initial consultation. And a lot of the routes don't require you to pay a lawyer to do a great deal, but it's just about, as I say, self-refer to ARU, as Chloe mentioned earlier, and seek legal advice. And then you know exactly where you are, as James says, from the outset, and you can move forward accordingly. It doesn't have to cost the earth. It's just about knowing the rights available to you and the options available to you immediately.
Tiny Seeds offers IVF travel grants to anybody who doesn't qualify for the government funding, and that is absolutely anybody that needs IVF who doesn't qualify for the government funding. So same-sex couples, single people, same-sex male couples undergoing surrogacy as well, they can apply. So that is a one-off £400 grant for people undergoing IVF who don't qualify for the government funding.
That's great.
I just want to say a really big thank you for joining us today. I think we've had a really important and really factual conversation about the options that are available and why it's so important to have this conversation and discuss what's available to the LGBTQ plus community. So I want to say a really big thank you. And I also really need to say a thank you to Corbett Lecane, who have sponsored this question and answer today for us as well and have made this conversation possible. So big thank you to Corbett Lecane as well.
Thank you.
Okay.